John Harrison had never been one to take shortcuts or disregard rules. As a former project manager with a knack for details, he approached every task methodically, ensuring no corners were cut. So, when he and his wife, Emily, purchased their dream home in a quiet suburban neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, he wasn't fazed by the homeowner association's reputation for strict regulations. On the contrary, John welcomed the structure and order the homeowner association promised to uphold. The first few months in their new home were idyllic. The backyard was spacious, perfect for their 2 children and their golden retriever, Max, to play freely. However, privacy soon became an issue. The Harrisons' lot backed onto a busy walking path, and pedestrians frequently stopped to peer into their yard. Sometimes, joggers would slow down to watch the kids play, and one incident involving a curious stranger snapping photos of Max through the hedge deeply unsettled Emily. It became clear that they needed a fence to secure their backyard. Determined to adhere to homeowner association guidelines, John dived into the community handbook, a thick document filled with dense language outlining every possible rule, from mailbox colors to acceptable plant species. The fence regulations spanned 8 pages. They were clear about acceptable heights, materials, and placement. Wood was permitted, but only in certain shades of stain. Vinyl was acceptable, but only in approved colors. Even the spacing between fence slats was regulated to ensure a uniform look throughout the neighborhood. John carefully drafted his fence proposal. He chose natural cedar wood, a material listed explicitly as acceptable, and picked a neutral stain that matched the community's color palette. He sketched out detailed diagrams showing the fence's height and layout, ensuring it adhered to the setback requirements from the property line. He even included a landscaping plan to add shrubs and flowers along the fence for aesthetic appeal, hoping to gain additional favor with the homeowner association board. Once the proposal was complete, John submitted it to the homeowner association office with a cover letter explaining his intentions and how his fence would enhance both the security and appearance of his property while complying with community standards. The homeowner association board required a 2-week review period for all applications, so John waited patiently for their response. Those 2 weeks dragged on. Emily was skeptical about whether the homeowner association would approve the project, given the horror stories they had heard from neighbors. One resident had recounted a tale of being fined for planting tulips instead of roses in their front garden. Another had been forced to repaint their home because the original shade of beige they had chosen was deemed too bold. Despite these stories, John remained optimistic. He had followed the rules to the letter and couldn't imagine why the homeowner association would deny his request. Finally, the letter arrived in the mail. John opened the envelope with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. To his relief, the letter stated that his fence proposal had been approved, provided he adhered to the specifications outlined in his submission. The approval was signed by the homeowner association president, indicating official endorsement. Armed with this approval, John wasted no time hiring a contractor. The fence installation was a significant expense, but John considered it an investment in their home and peace of mind. The contractors arrived the following week and worked diligently to construct the fence. Each board was measured and cut with precision, ensuring it met the exact specifications required by the homeowner association. By the end of the week, the fence was complete, a sturdy, beautiful structure that blended seamlessly with the rest of the neighborhood. The Harrisons were thrilled. The children could play in the yard without Emily constantly worrying about strangers, and Max had a secure space to roam. Even the neighbors complimented the fence, praising its quality and how well it fit the community's aesthetic. For a brief time, everything felt perfect. The Harrisons hosted a small barbecue to celebrate their newly secured backyard, inviting a few neighbors and their families. Laughter filled the air as the kids played, and John couldn't help but feel proud of the effort he had put into creating a safe, welcoming space for his family. But John's satisfaction was short-lived. 2 months later, a new letter arrived from the homeowner association. Unlike the congratulatory tone of the approval notice, this letter was curt and foreboding. It stated that the Harrisons' fence was now in violation of updated community regulations and demanded that it be removed within 30 days. The letter cited changes to the homeowner association bylaws regarding fence height and materials, claiming that the Harrisons' fence no longer met the newly established standards. John was dumbfounded. He reread the letter several times, hoping he had misunderstood its contents. How could a structure they had approved just 2 months earlier suddenly be in violation? And why were these changes applied retroactively? Surely his fence should be grandfathered under the old rules. These questions swirled in his mind as frustration began to bubble. He called Emily into the room and showed her the letter. She was equally shocked and immediately worried about the potential costs of removing and replacing the fence. John assured her he would get to the bottom of the issue. He decided to contact the homeowner association directly, convinced that there had been a mistake. The following morning, John walked into the homeowner association office with a folder containing all his documentation, the original application, the approval letter, and even receipts from the contractor. He presented these to the homeowner association administrator, a stern woman named Linda who seemed unimpressed by his efforts. Linda explained that the homeowner association had recently revised its regulations to ensure greater uniformity across the neighborhood. When John argued that his fence had been approved under the previous guidelines, Linda shrugged and said, "Regulations change. It's your responsibility to comply." "But what about grandfathering?" John pressed. "Surely existing structures approved under the old rules are exempt from new ones." "That's not how it works here," Linda replied coolly. "You'll need to remove the fence or face daily fines starting next month." Frustrated but undeterred, John requested a meeting with the homeowner association board to plead his case. Linda scheduled him for the next board meeting, 2 weeks away. In the meantime, John began researching his rights as a homeowner and talking to neighbors who had faced similar issues with the homeowner association. He learned that the board's decision-making process was often arbitrary, and their enforcement of rules frequently bordered on abusive. As the meeting date approached, John couldn't shake a growing sense of injustice. He had done everything right, followed every rule, and yet he was being punished. What should have been a simple project to improve his home had turned into a bureaucratic nightmare. Little did he know, the fight was only just beginning. The homeowner association board meeting was held on a Tuesday evening in the neighborhood's community center, a small, unassuming building that hosted everything from yoga classes to homeowner disputes. John arrived early, armed with a binder full of evidence meticulously organized to support his case. It included the original fence proposal, the approval letter, photos of the completed fence, and printouts of emails exchanged with the homeowner association administrator. He had even printed copies of the homeowner association's own regulations, highlighting the sections that supported his argument. The room slowly filled with people, other homeowners, board members, and a few curious onlookers. John recognized some of his neighbors in the crowd, including a retired couple who had mentioned their own run-ins with the homeowner association over their front yard garden. They gave him a nod of encouragement, though their faces carried the weary expressions of people who had already lost similar battles. At exactly 7 p.m., the homeowner association president, a sharp-dressed man in his late 50s named Gregory Walker, called the meeting to order. His tone was brisk, his demeanor authoritative. Gregory had a reputation for being inflexible, and his presence alone seemed to set the tone for the evening. This would not be an easy fight. John's case was third on the agenda, following a discussion about parking violations and a complaint about a neighbor's loud music. When his name was finally called, John stood up and approached the small podium at the front of the room. His hands were steady, but his heart raced as he faced the board, a group of 5 individuals seated behind a long table, each with a stack of papers and a clipboard in front of them. Gregory began. "Mr. Harrison, you've requested to address the board regarding the violation notice you received concerning your fence. You have 5 minutes to present your case." 5 minutes. John had spent hours preparing his argument, and now he had to condense it into just a few minutes. He took a deep breath and began. "Good evening, members of the board. I'm here to contest the violation notice I received last month regarding my fence. As you can see from the documents I've provided, this fence was built according to the homeowner association guidelines that were in place at the time. I submitted a detailed proposal, which was approved by this very board 2 months prior to the completion of the project. I followed every rule to the letter, and I have the approval documentation to prove it." He paused, scanning the faces of the board members. Most of them avoided his gaze, focusing instead on the papers in front of them. Gregory, however, looked directly at John, his expression unreadable. Despite this, John continued, I received a violation notice stating that my fence now contravenes new regulations. I understand that rules may change, but retroactively applying those changes to existing structures that were approved under previous guidelines is not only unfair, it's unreasonable. I'm requesting that this violation notice be rescinded and that my fence be grandfathered under the regulations that were in place at the time of its construction. John stepped back, his case presented. There was a moment of silence before Gregory leaned forward and addressed him. Thank you, Mr. Harrison. The board will now deliberate on your case. John returned to his seat, his heart pounding. The board members leaned toward one another, whispering and flipping through papers. Gregory occasionally nodded, his pen tapping rhythmically against his clipboard. The deliberation seemed to drag on forever, though it probably lasted only a few minutes. Finally, Gregory spoke. Mr. Harrison, while we appreciate your efforts to comply with the guidelines, the board has decided that the updated regulations must apply uniformly across the community. Allowing exceptions, even for previously approved structures, would set a precedent that undermines the integrity of our rules. John felt a wave of frustration rise in his chest. But this isn't just about exceptions, he said, his voice calm but firm. It's about fairness. How can homeowners trust this board if approvals can be overturned without warning? I invested time and money into this project based on your approval. Now you're telling me that all of that was meaningless? Gregory raised a hand to cut him off. The board's decision is final. You have 30 days to remove the fence or face daily fines as outlined in the violation notice. John opened his mouth to argue further but stopped himself. He knew that pressing the issue now would only make things worse. Instead, he gathered his binder and walked out of the community center, feeling a mix of anger and determination. If the board wouldn't listen, he would have to find another way to fight back. Over the next few days, John dove into research. He spent hours online, reading about homeowner association disputes and homeowners' rights. He discovered that while homeowner associations wield significant power, their actions were not above the law. Many states had regulations limiting how homeowner associations could enforce new rules on existing properties, and some even required a formal vote by homeowners to implement such changes. John also reached out to a real estate attorney, Dana Jacobs, who specialized in homeowner association disputes. Dana listened patiently as John explained his situation, reviewing the documentation he provided. She confirmed that the board had likely overstepped its authority by retroactively applying the new rules to his fence. This isn't just about your fence, Dana said during their first meeting. This is about accountability. If they get away with this, what's stopping them from doing the same to someone else next month? The law is on your side, but we'll need to approach this strategically. Dana recommended filing a formal dispute with the homeowner association, citing their failure to provide adequate notice of the rule changes and their disregard for procedural fairness. She also suggested gathering support from other homeowners who had faced similar issues, as a collective voice would carry more weight than a single complaint. John began talking to his neighbors, sharing his story and asking if they had experienced similar problems with the homeowner association. To his surprise, many of them had their own tales of frustration, unfair fines, arbitrary rule changes, and a general lack of transparency from the board. The retired couple who had initially encouraged him turned out to be particularly vocal, eager to support his efforts to hold the homeowner association accountable. As word spread, more residents came forward, forming an informal coalition of homeowners determined to challenge the board's overreach. They started a petition demanding greater transparency and fairness in the homeowner association's decision-making process, gathering signatures from nearly half the community within a week. Meanwhile, Dana filed the formal dispute on John's behalf, laying out a clear argument backed by legal precedent. The document highlighted the procedural errors in how the new rules were implemented and the financial and emotional toll the board's actions had taken on John and his family. The pressure was mounting, but John knew this was only the beginning. The homeowner association's response to the dispute would determine the next steps and whether his fight for fairness would lead to real change. The formal dispute filed by John and his attorney, Dana Jacobs, sent shockwaves through the homeowner association board. For years, the board had operated with little resistance, enforcing its rules with a heavy hand and often ignoring the concerns of the homeowners it was meant to serve. But this time was different. John's case wasn't just about a fence, it had become a symbol of the board's unchecked power and the mounting frustration of the neighborhood's residents. The homeowner association responded to the dispute by calling a special hearing, a rare occurrence that indicated just how seriously they were taking the challenge. The hearing was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon, giving John and his growing coalition of supporters time to prepare. Dana worked tirelessly, gathering additional evidence and crafting a compelling argument that combined legal precedent with an appeal to common sense and fairness. As the hearing approached, John felt a mix of nerves and determination. His once private battle with the homeowner association had become a public crusade, and he was no longer fighting just for himself. Neighbors stopped him on the street to offer words of encouragement, and the petition they had started now carried dozens of signatures, some accompanied by personal stories of unfair treatment by the board. The day of the hearing arrived and the community center was packed. Residents filled the room, standing shoulder to shoulder in a show of solidarity. Even those who hadn't signed the petition or spoken out against the homeowner association were curious to see how the dispute would unfold. At the front of the room, the board members sat behind their long table, their expressions ranging from stoic to visibly uncomfortable. Gregory Walker, the homeowner association president, maintained his usual air of authority, but there was a tension in his demeanor that hadn't been there before. Dana began by presenting John's case in meticulous detail. She outlined the timeline of events, emphasizing how John had followed every rule and received official approval for his fence before construction began. She then highlighted the procedural flaws in how the new regulations were implemented, including the lack of proper notice and the board's failure to grandfather existing structures. Her argument was clear, logical, and backed by copies of relevant state laws that limited the retroactive enforcement of homeowner association rules. When Dana finished, she turned to the room. "This isn't just about Mr. Harrison's fence," she said, her voice steady but firm. "This is about the principles of fairness and accountability. If the board can arbitrarily change the rules and punish homeowners who followed them in good faith, what's to stop them from doing the same to any of you?" The room erupted in murmurs of agreement. Several residents nodded, and a few even clapped, though Gregory quickly silenced them with a sharp rap of his gavel. The board's response was weak by comparison. Gregory attempted to justify their actions by claiming that the updated rules were necessary to maintain the neighborhood's aesthetic standards and property values. But when pressed by Dana and other residents during the QA portion of the hearing, it became clear that the board had not followed proper procedures. Gregory stumbled over questions about why homeowners weren't given adequate notice of the changes or why existing structures weren't exempted, eventually resorting to vague statements about the best interests of the community. As the hearing progressed, it became increasingly apparent that the board was on the defensive. Residents began sharing their own grievances, recounting instances of arbitrary fines, inconsistent rule enforcement, and a general lack of transparency. Each story added weight to John's case, painting a picture of an homeowner association that had overstepped its bounds for far too long. After hours of discussion, the board announced that they would take the matter under advisement and issue a decision within 2 weeks. It wasn't the immediate victory John had hoped for, but it was a step in the right direction. The following days were a whirlwind of activity. John and Dana worked to keep the momentum going, organizing a community meeting to discuss broader reforms for the homeowner association. Dozens of residents attended, eager to share their ideas and frustrations. Proposals ranged from establishing clearer guidelines for rule changes to implementing term limits for board members to prevent the concentration of power. Meanwhile, the local media caught wind of the story. A journalist from a regional newspaper interviewed John and several of his neighbors, publishing an article that cast a critical light on the homeowner association's practices. The story gained traction online, drawing comments from readers who shared similar experiences with their own homeowner associations. The added public pressure only increased the stakes for the board's upcoming decision. Finally, the day of reckoning arrived. The board issued a formal statement announcing their decision John's fence would be allowed to remain, and the violation notice was rescinded. The statement acknowledged that the board had failed to provide proper notice of the rule changes and that existing structures should have been grandfathered under the old guidelines. While they stopped short of admitting outright wrongdoing, the decision was a clear victory for John and his neighbors. The room erupted in applause when John shared the news at the next community meeting. Residents congratulated him, thanking him for standing up to the board and setting a precedent that would benefit everyone. For the first time in months, John felt a sense of relief and pride. His fight had been difficult, but it had made a real difference. But the story didn't end there. The fallout from the dispute led to sweeping changes within the homeowner association. Several board members, including Gregory Walker, resigned under pressure from the community. New elections were held, bringing in fresh faces who pledged to prioritize transparency and fairness. The petition John and his neighbors had started became the basis for a set of proposed reforms, many of which were implemented in the months that followed. John's fence remained standing, a testament to his persistence and the power of collective action. But more importantly, the neighborhood had changed. What had once been a community divided by fear and resentment of the homeowner association had become a place where residents felt empowered to speak up and hold their leaders accountable. And while John never intended to become a local hero, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction every time he looked at his backyard, knowing that his fight had been worth it. The fence wasn't just a structure, it was a symbol of the values that truly make a neighborhood a home: fairness, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what's right.